Governor, I want to look ahead to the Kansas City Fed's symposium in Jackson Hole next week. We've done a couple of great interviews together, you and I, out there. We both know what an amazing event it is. In terms of the market's expectation that Fed Chair Powell may give a more explicit statement on bond tapering, I want to step back from that and ask you, how important is that step by the Federal Reserve to other central banks, other bond markets around the world?
Without doubt, the US is the big person in the room, given the sheer size and volume of trading that goes in US dollar assets. So any signals from there are important. I'd probably like to emphasise really how similar, rather, across the globe, the economic environment is, rather than how different. Single global shock. New Zealand has been a few months ahead because we were in a strong starting position and had less disruption to date. So, there is a general desire to be able to re-normalise monetary policy across the globe. And, this nervousness around tantrums, stepping back or doing something too soon, it has to be put in today's context, not the context of back in 2015.
Another aspect that I think, and I'm wondering, again, you've been out there, so there's always a lot of chatter, a lot of conversation on the sidelines. This is particularly important for the Reserve Bank of New Zealand because it was the first central bank to adopt inflation targeting. Okay, 2% is the target. Now, Federal Reserve, European Central Bank are moving away from an explicit inflation target to average inflation targeting. As someone who's been involved in this and done central banking throughout, how do you assess that part of what is going on now and the conversations that might be had around that issue in Jackson Hole?
Yeah, I'm very pleased to see these conversations happening. We had to be so extreme back in the 1990s and 2000s because inflation expectations were just unanchored. So it had to be a single focus to really drive inflation credibility or low inflation credibility home. We're now able to use some of that dividend. Expectations are better anchored. It allows people to be more flexible through time. And remember, it's interesting how quickly we forget. Central banks have been nothing but accused of undershooting their inflation targets for so long, the Reserve Bank of New Zealand. So now we're only, a couple of quarters where we have higher than the midpoint inflation targets and everyone's getting concerned on the other side. So there's an inflation credibility dividend. Let's use that. Let's use it sensibly, but it always has a limit.
So the last tightening cycle in 2014, of course, there had to be a reversal of policy within that year. How much, I guess, of an extra element of pressure is there that, once you start, you want to be able to stay the course?
Well, fortunately, I'm old enough to have made every policy mistake known, I think. I've been accused of being too slow, being too fast, too aggressive, too timid. I don't think looking back at whatever the last policy challenge was gives you much insight into the next. This is why we've been using the framework around least regrets. At the beginning of this crisis, the least regret we wanted was to be accused of not having done enough soon enough. We are talking about our least regret now of having not moved soon enough around inflation expectations. So it's about the balance of risks. There will always be the unknowns. There will always be the hindsight genius. But we need to continue to move. We cannot wait for certainty. That does not exist.
How concerned would you be about the impact on the exchange rate, particularly as if and when you do go, the RBNZ will be the first or one of the first to start that tightening cycle? And it's really interesting. It's almost a canary in the coal mine scenario where the eyes of other central banks are very much focused on the RBNZ right now.
My ego wouldn't go that far to think that they're observing what in a small open economy in the South Pacific. But, it is really straightforward why we are having to do what we're doing, because our economy has been growing strongly. We have capacity constraints, inflation pressures are rising, and we're at maximum sustainable employment. So, it's not rocket science, but what could happen to the exchange rate. To date, given the nature of the global shock, it has not been a relative difference between countries. It's been all countries. I don't see that changing at all. All other things unchanged, you'd expect to see the exchange rate appreciate a little bit. But that overarching uncertainty of this pandemic has certainly been keeping exchange markets pretty contained, so the more the exchange rate does the work, of course, for a small open economy, the less the interest rates have to do the work. So, we can just observe, we can't control.
Well, I guess one advantage of the Fed announcing a tapering or more of a tightening move, Governor Orr, would be the dollar might keep strengthening, and that might take a little pressure off your currency should you decide to go ahead and make that rate hike in October. One final question. If you move in October, is it possible you're moving at the end of November? A lot of people looking for 2 more hikes next year, getting up maybe even higher than that and closer to that 2% neutral rate that you stressed at the press conference. You want people to know that that's what I think you're saying that's what they should be planning on at some point in the future.
Yeah, why wouldn't you plan on returning to some level of neutral through time? It's always the obvious mean reversion. I've been getting very worried that people lose sight of the big navigation stars ahead of us. The number one star there, of course, is what is a neutral interest rate? In New Zealand, if it's 2% nominal, that is still an incredibly historically low nominal interest rate, but it's well above where we are at the moment. So we've got a lot of work to do just to get back to neutral. If you have taken on a lot of debt where you can't sustain even something like that, then you're probably overexposed. So, it's a health warning to people. Stop thinking about at the margin, think about around those big navigation stars.